August 1962. Tan Son Nut Air Base, Saigon. A C-130 touches down in 90-degree heat, and 30 Australian soldiers step off with light packs and no fanfare, no tanks, no artillery, no battalion colors, just advisors with a simple mission: teach village troops to fight. Meanwhile, American staff officers brief their plan: air mobile battalions, heavy artillery, body count charts, the math of big war. Then something impossible starts happening. In remote outposts where no headlines reach, these scattered Australians begin earning the Commonwealth's highest award for valor: 4 Victoria Crosses, more decorations per man than any unit in Australian history, while entire U.S. divisions, with all their firepower and thousands of troops, earn none. The question isn't about courage. American soldiers fought just as hard. It's about where the hardest fights actually were. In a war famous for big numbers, 30 men proved that the smallest units of courage could change everything. The humidity hit like a wall. 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 80% humidity, and the kind of heat that soaked through khaki uniforms before the C-130's engines even wound down. 30 Australian officers and warrant officers stepped onto the tarmac at Tan Son Nut Air Base in August 1962, their FN/FAL rifles slung and their packs light. No heavy equipment rolled down the ramp, no tanks, no artillery pieces, no battalion colors snapping in the monsoon breeze. In the air-conditioned briefing rooms of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, American staff officers shuffled papers and updated their charts. One assessment, filed weeks earlier, described the Australian contribution in clinical terms: a token Commonwealth force, politically symbolic, militarily minor. The math seemed to support that view. 30 advisors against an enemy that moved in battalions. 30 men scattered across a country the size of New Mexico. But the Americans misunderstood what an advisor actually was. The definition fit on a single line: a foreign soldier attached to local units to teach tactics, call support, and sometimes fight beside them. What that meant in practice was something else entirely. These Australians would embed with Army of the Republic of Vietnam divisions from 1st Corps in the north down to 4th Corps in the Mekong Delta. They would live at remote outposts with 100 to 300 local troops and no Western backup for 20 to 50 miles. They would eat the same rations, walk the same patrols, and sleep in the same bunkers as men whose names they could barely pronounce. The idea clash was immediate and fundamental. American doctrine centered on big unit operations. Battalions lifted by UH-1 Hueys at 90 to 110 knots. Artillery preparations from 105mm batteries with ranges stretching 11 to 14,000 meters. The mathematics of mass and firepower, proven in World War II and Korea. Staff officers tracked sortie rates and body counts on charts that covered entire walls. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had different numbers in mind. Patrol in 4 to 12-man teams. Teach ambush techniques at 50 to 100 meters. Learn every paddy dike and tree line on foot. Walk at 1 kilometer per hour through jungle so thick that machetes wore down to nubs after a week of cutting trail. Their math was measured in meters, not miles. In squads, not battalions. Warrant Officer 2nd Class Jim McKenzie represented the typical AATTV advisor. 32 years old, a veteran of the Malayan Emergency, he had spent 3 years learning that jungle warfare was won by patience and precision, not speed and volume. His service record included 18 months patrolling the Thai-Malaysian border, where communist insurgents moved in groups of 8 to 15 men, and a successful ambush meant catching them at ranges under 100 meters. He read the initial American operational plans with growing skepticism. Body count charts assumed you could find the enemy in large enough groups to make division-sized operations worthwhile. Sortie rates measured activity, not effectiveness. That night, in a humid barracks room that smelled of diesel fuel and disinfectant, Mackenzie wrote in his field notebook, "You don't win a village with sortie numbers. You win it one patrol at a time, one trust at a time, one local soldier who decides to stand and fight instead of run." The first test came 18 months later, in the mountains near the Laotian border. Mackenzie and Warrant Officer 1st Class Tony Walsh were embedded with a company of Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops, conducting what the Americans called a reconnaissance in force. The Vietnamese captain wanted to move fast, cover ground, show activity on the daily reports. Mackenzie argued for slow movement, proper spacing, advanced scouts at 100-meter intervals. The captain won. The company moved in a column formation that would have been recognized by soldiers in World War I. 40 men bunched within 50 meters, following a well-used trail that led straight through a natural choke point between two ridgelines. Mackenzie and Walsh walked with the lead platoon, their PRC-25 radios crackling with static from nearby thunderstorms. The ambush opened at 11:30 in the morning with automatic weapons fire from three sides, AK-47s and at least one RPD machine gun, firing from positions no more than 150 meters away. The sound was distinctive, the sharp crack of 7.62 by 39 millimeter rounds, different from the heavier punch of American 7.62 NATO. The Vietnamese troops dove for cover, but the trail offered none. Open ground stretched 20 meters in every direction. Mackenzie keyed his radio handset and called for helicopter gunships. The nearest fire base was 18 minutes away by UH-1C at maximum speed, but the fight would be over in 10. He watched the Vietnamese point man crawl toward a fallen log, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, while enemy fire chewed the dirt around him. The rest of the platoon was pinned in a drainage ditch that offered cover from one direction and left them completely exposed to crossfire from the flanks. Walsh low-crawled to the wounded point man and began dragging him back toward the ditch. An AK burst kicked up mud 6 inches from his elbow. Mackenzie provided covering fire with his FN-FAIL, the heavy 7.62 millimeter rounds punching through bamboo and palm fronds but hitting nothing he could see. The enemy had positioned themselves well, with overlapping fields of fire and multiple escape routes. 20 minutes later, when the UH-1C gunships finally arrived, the jungle was quiet. The enemy had withdrawn, leaving behind empty cartridge cases and bloodstains that might or might not have been from their own casualties. The Vietnamese company counted 8 dead and 12 wounded. Mackenzie radioed the casualty report to headquarters, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. But the real lesson wasn't in the numbers, it was in what happened next. The Vietnamese captain approached Mackenzie and Walsh as they checked their equipment and prepared to call for medevac helicopters. His English was heavily accented but clear. "Next time, we do it your way, warrant officer. Slow movement, proper spacing, maybe fewer of my men die." Mackenzie nodded and made another entry in his field notebook. "If we don't change how these men fight, this is all we'll be doing, calling in casualty reports and watching good soldiers die because they bunch up on trails." The incident near the Laotian border established the pattern that would define the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam for the next decade. Small numbers, high risk, immediate personal stakes, and a growing realization that in a war where American divisions measured success in terms of enemy body counts and terrain captured, the real fighting was happening at the level of squads and platoons, in places where 30 Australian advisors might make the difference between a unit that survived and one that didn't. By 1965, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had grown past 100 advisors, scattered like pins on a map from Quang Tri Province in 1st Corps down to the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta in 4th Corps. Each pin represented 1 or 2 men responsible for anywhere from a company to an entire province. They were the only Australian unit to see nearly every type of terrain the country offered. Triple canopy jungle where visibility dropped to 30 meters. Open rice paddies that stretched to the horizon, mountain valleys where morning fog clung to ridgelines until noon, and coastal plains where salt air corroded rifle barrels in weeks instead of months. The training tempo was relentless and specific. Dawn meant marksmanship at ranges from 100 to 300 meters, working with whatever weapons the local forces carried. M1 Garands left over from World War II, their 8-round clips distinctive in the morning quiet. M16 rifles fresh from American supply depots, their lightweight 5.56 millimeter rounds effective out to 300 meters, but prone to jamming in humid conditions. ARVN carbines that fired pistol cartridges and were accurate to maybe 150 meters on a good day. The advisors taught the fundamentals that worked regardless of the weapon: proper sight picture, breathing control, trigger squeeze that didn't disturb the aim. Midday brought squad drills in heat that regularly topped 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Three-team fire and maneuver, with each team bounding forward in 5 to 10-meter rushes while the other two provided covering fire. The distances mattered. 5 meters was close enough to maintain unit cohesion in thick vegetation, but far enough apart that one grenade or mortar round couldn't take out an entire team. 10 meters was the maximum distance where hand signals still worked reliably and where a team leader could still control his men by voice without shouting and giving away positions. Night training focused on ambush techniques because that was when most of the killing happened. Claymore mines positioned 30 to 50 meters from the center of the kill zone, close enough for the steel ball bearings to be devastating against personnel, far enough away that the blast wouldn't injure the ambush team if the enemy managed to return fire with rockets or grenades. The advisors taught patience above all else. Let the entire enemy formation enter the kill zone before triggering the ambush, even if that meant watching the first enemy soldiers pass within arm's reach of hidden positions. The hardware lessons were brutally practical. The FN-FAL carried by most advisors fired a 7.62mm NATO round that was effective out to 600 meters and would punch through most cover, but the rifle and its ammunition were heavy. A basic combat load of 100 rounds weighed over 6 pounds, not counting the 9-pound rifle itself. In contrast, the AK-47s carried by Viet Cong forces used a smaller 7.62 by 39mm cartridge that was lighter and allowed fighters to carry more ammunition, but was less effective at long range. The advisors learned to use this difference tactically, choosing engagement ranges where their heavier rounds gave them an advantage. Radio communications presented constant challenges. The PRC-25 radios used by advisors were VHF sets with a theoretical range of 3 to 5 miles, depending on terrain and atmospheric conditions. In practice, that meant climbing hills under fire to establish contact with supporting aircraft. A typical scenario involved an advisor calling for close air support from an A-1 Sky Raider, circling at 5,000 feet and 250 knots. The pilot needed precise coordinates, target description, and friendly positions marked clearly enough that he could deliver ordnance within 100 meters of friendly troops without causing casualties. The clash between American and Australian approaches became evident in convoy operations. Captain Robert Henderson of the Royal Australian Regiment was embedded with an ARVN battalion in Binh Dinh province when their Vietnamese commander announced plans for a supply convoy to move ammunition and rations to 3 outposts. The Vietnamese approach was straightforward. Load 6 trucks with supplies and guards, then drive the 30 kilometers of Route 1 at maximum safe speed. Henderson argued for different tactics. Stagger the vehicles at 100 to 150 meter intervals instead of the 50-meter spacing the Vietnamese preferred. Mount M60 machine guns on pintleys in the lead and trail vehicles, with crews trained to engage targets out to 800 meters. Use air reconnaissance to scout the route 1 hour before the convoy moved, looking for fresh dirt that might indicate buried mines or unusual activity in villages along the way. The Vietnamese battalion commander dismissed most of these suggestions as overcautious. American convoys moved much faster and with less elaborate preparation. The 6 trucks loaded with supplies and a platoon of guards departed at 0800 hours, moving in close formation at 60 kilometers per hour along the predictable route. The attack came at a bridge crossing 12 kilometers south of the base. A single B-40 rocket struck the second truck in the convoy, and the explosion was powerful enough to damage the truck immediately behind it. 2 vehicles destroyed, 8 soldiers killed, and 24 wounded, all because the spacing had been too tight and the convoy had followed a predictable pattern. 3 days later, Henderson convinced the battalion commander to try the Australian method. The second convoy used proper spacing, had machine guns mounted and manned, and followed a route that had been scouted by helicopter an hour earlier. When the Viet Cong triggered a command-detonated mine under the lead vehicle, only 1 truck was lost. The trail vehicle's M60 crew engaged the ambush positions immediately, forcing the attackers to break contact before they could inflict additional casualties. The difference in results was stark enough that word spread through other ARVN units in the province. Convoys started using wider spacing and better security procedures. Casualty rates dropped measurably over the following months, though the improvements never made it into the statistical reports that reached higher headquarters. To staff officers tracking large unit operations and monthly body counts, a few dozen lives saved in convoy ambushes was a minor detail, But to Warrant Officer Gary Stevens, embedded with a regional forces company in the same province, the change represented something more significant. He had watched the same local soldiers for 8 months, learning their names and the names of their families. When fewer of them came back wounded or dead from routine supply runs, it meant something that couldn't be measured in the charts and graphs that dominated briefing rooms in Saigon. Stevens wrote in his journal that night, "You can't count what doesn't happen, can't put prevented casualties on a body count chart, but Nguyen's wife won't be a widow this month, and his kids will have a father who comes home from patrols. That's the kind of math that matters out here, even if nobody at headquarters will ever see it in a report." The advisor system was proving itself one patrol, one convoy, one firefight at a time, but its successes were measured in negative numbers: attacks that failed, ambushes that were avoided, casualties that didn't happen. In a war where progress was measured by statistics and territory captured, the most important victories were often invisible. 4 men, 4 different provinces, 4 different years, 4 decisions that would define what it meant to be an advisor when the doctrine said to leave, but the mission demanded staying. Each Victoria Cross told the same story in different words. When everything else failed, one Australian soldier chose to stand between his men and destruction. Warrant Officer Kevin Wheatley earned his reputation in the bars and rugby fields of Sydney before the Army taught him how to fight. But in the Tra Bong Valley of Quang Ngai Province on November 13, 1965, his protective instincts focused on something more serious than a teammate getting blindsided. The patrol included 20 Vietnamese Civil Irregular Defense Group soldiers and 2 Australian advisors, moving through terrain that offered perfect cover for an ambush: dense vegetation, multiple escape routes, and ridgelines that provided firing positions overlooking the valley floor. The enemy opened fire from less than 200 meters away, close enough that individual muzzle flashes were visible through the jungle canopy. Automatic weapons fire from at least 3 positions, coordinated and disciplined. Warrant Officer Ron Swanton took a burst through the chest and went down hard, bleeding from multiple wounds and unable to move under his own power. Standard procedure was clear: break contact, establish a rally point, call for helicopter extraction, and get out with whatever wounded could be moved quickly. Wheatley looked at his wounded teammate and made a different calculation. Swanton was dying, but he was still alive. The evacuation helicopter was inbound, but it would need a secure landing zone and covering fire from the ground. The Vietnamese irregulars were already pulling back toward the extraction point, following their training. Wheatley had maybe 2 magazines of 7.62mm ammunition. Left, enough for perhaps 60 aimed shots if he conserved his fire and made every round count. He told the helicopter crew to take the other wounded first and come back for him and Swanton. Then he positioned himself to cover his fallen comrade, using a fallen log for protection and calculating fields of fire that would keep the enemy from overrunning their position. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 1 man with a rifle against an estimated 30 to 40 Viet Cong fighters who knew the terrain and had prepared positions. But Wheatley had established the unwritten rule that would define the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam for the rest of the war: never leave your people behind, regardless of what the tactical manual recommended. Major Peter Badco brought a different kind of intensity to the advisor role. Artillery officers were supposed to coordinate fire support from command posts, using radios and maps to direct guns that might be 10 kilometers away from the target. But Badco had spent enough time with regional and popular forces in Thu Thien Province to understand that leadership sometimes required physical presence at the point of contact. During 3 separate actions between February and April of 1967, he repeatedly crossed open ground under heavy fire to rally units that were beginning to break under pressure. The terrain worked against him every time. Rice paddies offered no cover for 200 to 300 meters in any direction. A competent machine gun crew firing 500 to 600 rounds per minute could put 8 to 10 rounds per second into that open space, creating a killing zone that few men would choose to enter. But Badco watched South Vietnamese soldiers beginning to waver, saw unit cohesion starting to collapse, and made the calculation that his presence might tip the balance between an organized withdrawal and a complete rout. He crossed those fields at a dead run, weaving between bursts of automatic weapons fire because he understood something that couldn't be taught in staff college. Soldiers fight harder when they see their leaders sharing the same risks. A major was supposed to coordinate and advise, not lead infantry charges. But in the scattered firefights of Thua Thien Province, traditional rank structures meant less than the example of one man who refused to ask others to do what he wouldn't do himself. Warrant Officer Ray Simpson carried decades of combat experience into the Special Forces camps of Kontum Province. World War II, Korea, Malaya. Enough wars to understand that courage wasn't about feeling brave, but about functioning effectively when everything inside you wanted to run. On May 6, 1969, Simpson was working with Montagnard troops when their position came under sustained attack from a force that outnumbered them at least 2-1. The fighting was close and personal, with enemy positions less than 50 meters away and visibility, limited by thick jungle canopy. Simpson's M16 rifle was loaded with 20-round magazines, which meant he had to count shots and plan reloading cycles around the rhythm of incoming fire. Each trip forward to retrieve wounded soldiers meant exposing himself to concentrated fire from multiple positions, with no guarantee that he would make it back to his own lines. He made those trips anyway, multiple times, because he had learned in earlier wars that small units survived when every man mattered. In a company-sized engagement, losing 3 or 4 soldiers might be acceptable casualties. In a platoon-sized fight with indigenous troops who were already outnumbered, every wounded man retrieved might mean the difference between holding the position and watching the entire unit disintegrate under pressure. Warrant Officer Keith Payne faced the most complex tactical situation of the 4, commanding a Mike Force company of approximately 200 men when they were attacked by 2 to 3 battalions of North Vietnamese regulars near Long Con on May 24, 1969. The enemy had achieved tactical surprise and numerical superiority in terrain that favored the defense. Visibility was limited to 30 meters or less. Enemy forces were using RPG-2 rockets and mortars, and friendly artillery support was available but dangerous to use at close range. Over the course of more than 3 hours, Payne found himself functioning as a one-man command and control system for a unit that had lost most of its normal leadership structure. He moved through the perimeter repeatedly, using whatever weapons were available. His personal M16 captured AK-47s when his own ammunition ran low, pistol and grenades when the situation required close-quarters fighting. Navigation was by compass and dead reckoning, complicated by the need to avoid enemy positions while gathering scattered survivors. The final breakout through enemy lines involved leading approximately 40 men through gaps that existed more by luck than planning, moving by sound and instinct through terrain that offered dozens of places for ambush. Payne's success in bringing those men out alive demonstrated what the advisor system could accomplish when everything else failed. One experienced soldier willing to assume personal responsibility for every life under his command. 4 different provinces, 4 different tactical situations, 4 different years of the war. But the pattern was identical. Advisors who refused to accept the limitations of their official role when the situation demanded more. They had been sent to teach and coordinate, not to lead infantry assaults or risk their lives for wounded comrades. But when the moment came, each man chose the mission over the manual, the lives of his soldiers over his own survival. The mathematics of their sacrifice would define the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam for the remainder of the war. 33 killed and 100. 22 wounded in a unit that never numbered more than a few hundred men at any given time. But the 4 Victoria Crosses represented something beyond casualty statistics. They marked the points where advisory doctrine evolved from teaching to leading, from coordinating to commanding, from surviving to ensuring that others survived instead. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had become something unprecedented, a human intelligence network spread across 4 military regions, reporting conditions that no division-sized unit would ever see. By 1968, advisors were embedded in provinces where no Australian battalion had ever operated, living with regional and popular forces that rarely appeared in the major tactical reports flowing back to Canberra and Washington. Their collective experience created a picture of the war that existed nowhere else in the Allied command structure. In First Corps, Warrant Officer Michael Patterson reported declining morale among Army of the Republic of Vietnam units around Hue and Da Nang. The soldiers were competent enough, but their officers were increasingly focused on survival rather than aggressive operations. Units that had performed well in 1966 were now reluctant to patrol more than 3 kilometers from their base camps, and night operations had become almost impossible to organize. But Patterson also reported that the regional forces in the same area were showing marked improvement after 2 years of consistent advisor presence. Local soldiers defending their home villages fought with determination that regular ARVN troops often lacked. The pattern was repeated across the country. In Second Corps, advisors working with Montagnard units in the Central Highlands described tactical competence that rivaled anything they had seen among regular forces. The indigenous soldiers knew their terrain intimately, moved quietly through jungle that reduced most units to stumbling noise, and showed remarkable discipline under fire. Their weakness was in calling and coordinating support fires, but intensive advisor training was producing platoon leaders who could talk aircraft onto targets and adjust artillery with precision that impressed even veteran forward observers. Third Corps presented a mixed picture. Around Saigon and the heavily populated provinces, ARVN performance remained inconsistent but showed gradual improvement in units that had worked with the same advisors for extended periods. The key seemed to be continuity. Soldiers who had trained with the same Australian warrant officer for 12 to 18 months developed confidence in techniques that might have seemed foreign or overly cautious initially. Casualty rates in these units dropped measurably, and their willingness to accept night ambush missions increased correspondingly. Fourth Corps, in the Mekong Delta, offered the most encouraging reports. The flat, open terrain favored conventional tactics, and the dense population meant that local forces had strong motivation to defend their communities. Advisors reported that Popular Forces units trained according to Australian methods were successfully conducting independent operations against Viet Cong tax collectors and supply movements. Small victories, measured in squads rather than battalions, but victories that meant something to the villages involved. The decorations told their own story, and it was a story that had no precedent in Australian military history. 4 Victoria Crosses, 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 6 Military Crosses, 20 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 15 Military Medals. Beyond the individual awards, the team had earned unit citations that recognized collective performance: the United States Army Meritorious Unit Commendation, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm, and eligibility for the United States Presidential Unit Citation and Valorous Unit Award. No Australian formation of comparable size had ever accumulated such recognition, but the mathematics of recognition came with corresponding costs. By 1970, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was suffering casualty rates that would have been unsustainable for a larger unit. 33 killed and 122 wounded among approximately 1,000 men who served with the team over its 10-year deployment. The percentages were stark: roughly 15% killed or wounded, concentrated among men who served in the most dangerous assignments for the longest periods. The awards weren't distributed randomly across the team's areas of operation. They clustered around the remote outposts where advisors lived closest to the enemy and farthest from support. Special Forces camps in the Central Highlands, where helicopter extraction might be 20 minutes away in good weather and impossible during monsoon conditions. Border surveillance sites where 2 or 3 advisors worked with company-sized indigenous units, monitoring infiltration routes that regular forces couldn't patrol consistently. Mobile strike force operations that moved deep into enemy-controlled territory with minimal backup and maximum exposure to ambush. The strategic context made their achievements both more impressive and more poignant. Even as the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was earning its reputation as the most highly decorated formation in Australian military history, the larger war was sliding toward Vietnamization and American withdrawal. United States troop levels peaked at over 540,000 in 1969, then began a steady decline toward 150,000 by 1972. As American combat units departed, responsibility shifted increasingly to South Vietnamese forces supported by advisors who found themselves with more responsibility and less backup. Major General Charles Timms, who commanded Military Assistance Command Vietnam's advisory effort, described the situation in a classified assessment that reached Australian headquarters in late 1970. As conventional forces withdraw, the advisory mission becomes both more critical and more dangerous. Advisors are increasingly the primary link between indigenous units and supporting fires. the main source of tactical expertise for local commanders, and often the only experienced combat leaders available when units come under pressure. The implications were clear to everyone involved. Warrant Officer Jim McKenzie, now on his second tour with the team, wrote to his wife in March 1971, "The job keeps getting harder, but it also keeps getting more important. There are fewer of us, and the Vietnamese units need us more than ever. It's not about winning the war anymore. It's about giving these soldiers the best chance to survive when we're gone." The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was performing at the highest levels of professional competence, earning recognition that exceeded anything in the nation's military history. But they were doing so in a war that was being abandoned by its major participants, working with local forces that would soon be left to fight without foreign support or sophisticated logistics systems. The final phase of the team's deployment would be defined by this paradox: maximum individual achievement in the context of strategic failure, extraordinary personal courage applied to a mission that was being overtaken by political realities beyond any soldier's control. On a hillside fire base in Quang Tri Province in late 1971, Captain Bruce Morrison looked through his binoculars at a valley where he had spent 18 months training regional forces platoons in small unit tactics. The soldiers were competent now, capable of independent operations that would have been impossible when he first arrived, but American artillery support was being withdrawn, helicopter assets were becoming scarce, and medical evacuation that had once been routine was now subject to availability and weather conditions. Morrison made a final entry in his operational journal. "We've taught them everything we can about fighting. What we couldn't teach them was how to fight without us." The final photograph was taken at 0700 hours on December 18, 1972. Morning light filtered through the humid air at Tan Son Nhut Air Base as the last members of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam walked across the tarmac toward a Royal Australian Air Force C-130. Behind them, the war continued. Ahead of them lay questions that would follow them for decades. What had they accomplished? What had they left undone? Had 10 years, 4 months, and 27 days in country made any measurable difference? The statistics were unprecedented in Australian military history. 1,009 men had served with the team over its deployment. 33 had been killed in action, 122 wounded. 4 Victoria Crosses, the Commonwealth's highest award for valor. 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 6 Military Crosses, 20 Distinguished Conduct Medals, 15 military medals. Unit citations that included the United States Army Meritorious Unit Commendation and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm. No formation of comparable size in any previous war had accumulated such recognition. But the numbers that mattered most couldn't be found on any awards list or casualty report. They existed in the memory of soldiers who had learned to patrol without bunching on trails, to set ambushes at proper distances, to call for supporting fires with coordinates precise enough to save lives rather than waste ammunition. In outposts scattered across 4 military regions, small improvements in tactical competence had accumulated into measurable reductions in friendly casualties and increases in successful operations. Warrant Officer Jim McKenzie, now completing his second tour with the team, carried a notebook filled with details that would never appear in any official history. 3rd Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, casualty rates down 30% after 18 months of advisor presence. Popular Forces Company, 772, Binh Dinh Province, successfully defending their village against 3 separate attacks, using ambush techniques learned from Australian instructors. Mike Force Battalion. 314, conducting independent operations in areas where they had previously required constant support. The improvements were real, measurable, and ultimately insufficient. The strategic context that had brought advisors to Vietnam in 1962 had changed fundamentally by 1972. American combat forces were gone, political support for the war had collapsed, and the South Vietnamese military was being asked to defend territory that had never been fully secured even with massive foreign assistance. Major Peter Davidson, one of the last team commanders, understood the contradiction better than most. His unit had achieved the highest per capita decoration rate in Australian military history while serving in a war that was ending in defeat. Individual soldiers had performed with extraordinary courage and competence in service of a strategy that was being abandoned by its architects. The math was brutal. Maximum personal sacrifice applied to a mission that politics had rendered impossible. The helicopter flight from his final firebase to Saigon gave Davidson a chance to see the war from 2,000 feet and 90 knots. Below, the landscape showed 10 years of fighting, bomb craters filled with monsoon water, abandoned fire support bases grown over with jungle, roads that were secure during daylight hours but belonged to the enemy after dark. The South Vietnamese soldiers at scattered outposts looked capable enough from altitude, but Davidson knew what the maps and statistics couldn't show: how those units would perform when the last advisors were gone and the supporting fires were no longer available. The strategic failure didn't diminish what individual advisors had accomplished at the tactical level. In villages whose names never appeared in major newspapers, casualty rates had dropped when training programs succeeded in changing how local forces conducted operations. Platoons that had once walked single file on predictable routes learned to use proper spacing and multiple approach paths. Ambush teams that had previously revealed their positions too early learned patience and fire discipline that multiplied their effectiveness. The doctrine itself had been proven sound. Small teams of experienced soldiers, living with local forces, sharing their risks and learning their languages, could achieve results that were impossible for conventional units operating from large bases. The template would be applied again in later conflicts: Iraq, Afghanistan, and dozens of smaller operations where advisor missions proved their value. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam had established the model for what modern military advisors could accomplish when properly selected, trained, and employed. But success at the tactical level couldn't overcome failure at the strategic level. The South Vietnamese forces that advisors had trained with such care would be left to fight a conventional war against an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them, using equipment that required maintenance and logistics systems that were already breaking down as foreign support was withdrawn. 40 years later, in a veterans' hall in Brisbane, former warrant officer Mackenzie fingered the ribbon bar on his dress uniform: the Vietnam Medal with clasp, the Australian Active Service Medal, the Vietnamese Campaign Medal. Not the Victoria Cross, but recognition for service that had demanded everything from him and thousands like him. A younger relative, perhaps a grandson, asked the question that haunted every veteran of the war: "Was it worth it, Grandpa?" Mackenzie considered the question carefully before answering. He thought about villages where properly trained local soldiers had held their ground when conventional wisdom said they should have run. About casualty reports that showed fewer friendly dead and wounded after advisor programs had time to take effect. About South Vietnamese platoon leaders who had learned to call supporting fires accurately enough to break up enemy attacks that might otherwise have overrun their positions. "The medals are for a few minutes in the worst days of your life," Mackenzie finally said. "The real test was whether the platoon you trained could walk out of the valley when the shooting started, and most of the time, they could." The brass memorial plaque near the entrance to the hall recorded the essential: statistics. Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, 1962 to 1972. 1,009 served, 33 killed, 122 wounded. 4 Victoria Crosses, multiple unit citations, decorations that exceeded any comparable formation in the nation's military history. In a war famous for big numbers and massive operations, 30 advisors had proven that the smallest units of courage could still change individual battles, save specific lives, and demonstrate that training and example mattered more than mass and firepower. The strategic war had been lost, but the tactical victories accumulated by scattered two-man advisor teams represented something that couldn't be measured in body counts or territory controlled: the persistent human capacity to do the job correctly even when the larger mission was failing.